Joining us this morning is Philippe Nassif, Executive Director of In Defense of Christians, who's moderating a discussion today on Capitol Hill about Turkey, human rights and religious freedom there. And maybe he can start by giving us a thumbnail sketch about what exactly is going on in Turkey related to religious freedom. Good morning, Philippe.
Yes, good morning. Wonderful to be with all of you this morning. So, we at IDC, In Defense of Christians, have organized this event on Capitol Hill today. It's sort of a culmination of a lot of our advocacy work on Capitol Hill and around the country with members of Congress and U.S. policymakers and the administration on holding Turkey and its leadership run by Mr. Erdogan accountable for relatively oppressive policies toward the press, towards human rights activists, and certainly toward religious figures, religious minorities of all kinds, many of them being Christian. And so the more sort of well-known example is the imprisonment of Pastor Brunson, who has been in jail in Turkey, accused of being a part of the attempted coup that took place almost 2 years ago, and thrown in jail without any sort of legal recourse. And so our organization, along with several other organizations, have come together to really hold Turkey and its government accountable because they're a NATO ally, supposedly a very good ally of the United States and of the European Union. And we are extremely concerned regarding the crackdown of religious activists and religious freedom in general and human rights activists, and we want to see a change.
I was at a meeting in Capitol Hill recently on this subject, on a broader level of the whole Middle East, and I was shocked at the story of this pastor who's an American, I believe. Is there a diplomatic efforts being made also to free him?
There are diplomatic efforts being made. What the Turkish government is basically doing is they're saying, if you hand over Fethullah Gulen, who is sort of a dissident who runs his own network of this philosophical Muslim group that has a very popular appeal around the world. He's actually based in Pennsylvania. He's here in the United States. They are claiming that he was behind the coup because him and Erdogan have a long history of animosity. And they're demanding the United States hand him over in order for Pastor Brunson to be released. So essentially he's being held hostage, and they're asking for a ransom payment, which is the United States handing over Fethullah Gulen.
Philippe, this is Father Petrie. I'm curious if you could just let our listeners know, what is the status of Christians in Turkey legally? They're certainly a religious minority, but do they have freedoms? What is their status?
Sure. So there's a variety of Christian groups that still live in Turkey. Granted, they're less than 1% of the population at this point. We're talking about Greek Christians, Greek Orthodox, that have been there since the Ottomans took over parts of Western Turkey that used to be part of Greece. We're talking about Armenian Christians, the more well-known group in Turkey. Many of them, as we know, fled a genocide committed by the Ottoman Empire, so the vast majority of them don't live in Turkey anymore, but there are still communities there in eastern Turkey. And then we have Chaldean and Assyrian Christian groups. They're more well-known in Iraq and recently suffered the genocide committed by ISIS, but they also have a presence in Turkey as well. All of these groups are heavily persecuted. They are really unable to worship freely. And in fact, the Turkish government has implemented some policies more recently where their lands are being seized. If they own church property, that church property has now been taken over by the state. Even private property has been taken over by the state in many cases in some of these communities. And so that's a very big concern that we have, how to protect these very small communities.
I wonder how far our alliance can go with a country that continues to violate religious freedom. Is there any sense from you or anyone else that's involved in this, that's close to it, that the U.S. would put some pressure on Turkey to say, hey, either you act like a free country or, we're not going to support you anymore?
This is sort of the objective of our event today on Capitol Hill and the many, many months, I'd say over the past year, of lobbying efforts that we've put in. We, up until recently, have not seen the United States government willing to take Turkey on and hold Turkey accountable for its imprisonment of U.S. citizens, let alone the seizure of church properties and its overall oppression of these religious and ethnic minorities. I've seen a shift more recently when we're holding Turkey a little bit more accountable. Does that mean that we're going to go as far as we need to go? I don't see an indication of that yet. However, I do hope that changes. There's a lot of security implications for a more rupture of U.S.-Turkey relationships that would impact our intelligence gathering and military operations in the region. I think that's what's got the administration very concerned. But the Turks just pulled their ambassador out of Washington due to the Gaza protests, I think, yesterday or the day before. So the relationships at an all-time low. And in fact, they've often been their own worst advocates and enemy on Capitol Hill, mainly because of the more recent arrest of Pastor Brunson and American citizens that work for Amnesty International. So that's helping us to message this a little bit more clearly to policymakers.
It's also very dangerous in Turkey to be a journalist, isn't it? They've also come down on freedom of the press.
Extremely. In fact, we had several journalists that were going to be on our panel that ended up we publicly didn't put them anymore on our panel because they were threatened by the Turkish government as soon as they heard about the event we were hosting on Capitol Hill. These are folks that live in the United States. So that just gives you an idea of what happens if you're in Turkey and you dare to criticize the government and its policies. It's extremely dangerous to be a journalist. It's extremely dangerous to be an activist of any kind. Amnesty International has advocated for the release of a lot of political prisoners and journalists in particular, and their whole office was raided in Istanbul about 8 months ago, and several of their staff members who are U.S. citizens were also thrown in jail and have not seen the light of day since then. So this is a very serious pattern of escalation, I would call it, just in the past year on behalf of the Turkish government in terms of their blatant disregard for international law, let alone human rights.
Well, we're very glad, Philippe. We're very glad, Philippe, that In Defense of Christians is shining a light on this situation, and we wish you much success today in Capitol Hill.
We thank you very much for your prayers and your thoughts, and hope to be back on soon.
Great, and
Thank
learn
you.
more at indefenseofchristians.org.